and welcome to this last session of the joint BELMAS-CCAM conference. This is a keynote address that's going to be sponsored by CCAM, and we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Mary Berryman. Her address is going to be on the screen after I introduce her, and then she will be coming on live to answer your questions and interact with us. I met Mary first in about 2006 when she was a doctoral student, working with Russell Bishop and others in the well-known program Te Kotaitanga in New Zealand. Subsequently, after her doctorate, she became an associate professor at the University of Waikato in Hamilton, rose through the ranks to be a full professor there, and is still there. She took the best parts, the culturally relevant pedagogy from Te Kotaitanga, and created Kieke Panuku, which is a leadership education program in consultation with Māori, Kiwi, and Māori, Iwi, and others, and really focused on preparing school leaders, again, in a sensitive, theoretical, transformative, and culturally relevant way. And so, of course, Mary has lots of publications, lots of international addresses. You could read that on her Vita. I just want to tell you that in 2016, she was awarded as an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for her services to Māori and education in general. And in 2017, she was a finalist for the New Zealander of the Year. So we are really privileged to have Mary talking to us today, and I give you her presentation at this time.
I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā maunga, i ngā awa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In New Zealand, our national kahikitia strategy, which began in 2008, aimed to reform schooling so that Indigenous Māori students, or people like me, could enjoy and achieve education success as Māori. However, for us as a nation, the implementation of this policy has been very challenging. Perhaps this is because equity and belonging can only become a reality for all learners when we understand the historical events that have seen the systematic belittlement and redefinition of Indigenous peoples through the education system. An education system that was set up to civilise the natives and assimilate them into predefined roles within New Zealand society. To explore these ideas, I begin with the start of the Te Kotaitanga research. I then reach back to some historical events to consider the ongoing influence of untold narratives as myth takes through our colonial education system, a situation that aligns with many other Indigenous peoples across the globe. I conclude with leaders who have built on a deeper appreciation of our shared histories and prioritised more strategic relationships with Māori. These leaders are developing processes for indigenising and decolonising the culture and structure of their schools. Without this, the intergenerational disparity for Māori is likely to continue. However, with a more purposeful disruption to the status quo, these leaders have much to teach others faced with the same challenge. In 2001, as part of the Te Kotaitanga research, Year 9 and 10 Māori learners, some of their family members, their teachers, and their school principals were asked what from their own experiences would engage Māori more in our schooling system. We heard many negative things about Māori students, such as the experience of this teacher. We also heard negative things from Māori learners about their schooling, such as teachers who they believed were racist. At this time, the term racist was seldom used in New Zealand. Instead, as a nation, we promoted a discourse of racial harmony, of being Kiwis and all the same. From the participants' experiences, we undertook a thematic analysis. We found that the solutions to engagement covered 3 different discursive positions. One position was to do with the Māori child and their home culture. Another was to do with the structures of secondary schools. And the third was to do with the pedagogical relationships and interactions between Māori learners and their teachers. We graphed these data and found that Māori learners, their families, and their school principals viewed solutions to engagement as largely being in the cultural relationships and interactions within classroom pedagogy. However, the majority of their teachers argued that the problems to do with Māori learners and their families left them with little agency to disrupt this problem and to bring about positive change. In Te Kotahitanga, we began to talk about the situation as deficit theorising. From these experiences, we developed an effective teaching profile. Foundational to this profile were 2 understandings. Firstly, the need to disrupt what I had come to understand was in the hearts of many, the need to positively reject deficit theorising about Māori learners. And secondly, to know how to bring about change. While I did not know how deficit theorising had become so firmly entrenched in our hearts, as a Māori learner, a mother, a grandmother, I knew deficit theorising about Māori was a reality that was negatively affecting the lives of disproportionate numbers of Māori learners. It was the reason I had left teaching to become a researcher. At the time, secondary school teachers were expected to maintain a professional, almost impersonal, disconnected relationship with learners and the families of these learners. However, Māori students had told us they wanted a more personal, reciprocal relationship with their teachers. Therefore, through the Te Kotahitanga professional development, teachers were supported to change the relationships they had with these learners by respecting their culture, having high expectations of them, and creating secure learning environments. Collectively, this would change the culture of classrooms and make Māori learners want to engage in learning. At the same time, pedagogical structures that maintain the expert transmission of knowledge to learners could be disrupted. We would support teachers to share power with their learners and engage them in learning using more dialogic, interactive, and evidence-informed strategies. While we understood these elements as needing to be interrelated and dependent on each other, one of the biggest challenges continues to be people who understand these as being a transactional tick box of individual ideas. I continue to hear people say things such as, "Yes, I know, it's all about relationships," or "It's just about good teaching." The last phase of Te Kotahitanga finished in 2014. Other school reform initiatives calling for the use of culturally responsive pedagogy have followed. In 2018, the New Zealand Schools Trustees Association and the then Children's Commissioner published a report called Education Matters to Me. Their study involved nearly 1,700 children and showed that many young Māori still felt that they were being treated unequally at school because they were Māori. Iona Holstead, the head of the Ministry of Education, responded on national radio by saying, "In the schooling and education system and beyond, we have an issue of unconscious bias. Māori student underachievement is chronic, intractable, and systemic." It seemed that the voices of Māori learners gathered in 2001 and our reform efforts had achieved very little cohesive spread. In fact, the national picture may well have worsened because in this latest report, the voices of immigrant children of colour also appeared. I turned to Moana Jackson for solutions. Moana, who passed away this year, was a formidable intellectual, an outstanding lawyer, leader, teacher, scholar, and global advocate for Indigenous rights. He has left us much to be inspired by. He wrote that to understand and respond to our challenges in education, we needed to better understand the historical biases and prejudices in our racialised colonial system. For the first time, I also met his term myth takes, which he described as deliberately concocted falsehoods to justify a process that is actually unjustifiable. I recalled a painting that seemed to make sense within his definition. This famous painting was by Charles Goldie and his former teacher, Lewis Steele. It was modelled after a painting called The Raft of the Medusa, which was exhibited in Paris 3 years after a French naval vessel was wrecked off the coast of Senegal and 15 of the 147 people on board survived on a raft for 13 days. The painting portrayed the moment when the survivors saw a rescue ship. The figures on the raft are suffering from extreme starvation and despair. Goldie had seen the original painting prior to coming out to New Zealand in the 1800s. The composition of Goldie and Steele's later painting replicates the Medusa, even down to the positioning of some of the individual figures. Although commentators this century have criticised Goldie and Steele's painting as wholly inaccurate and condescending to the Polynesian navigators who made deliberate voyages of exploration around the Pacific, this painting contributed to myth takes about how the Māori people arrived in Aotearoa. It was suggested that early Polynesians voyaged to Aotearoa by accident after getting blown off course, while Māori themselves explained that their ancestors voyaged here in planned and determined ways. Questions based on these two contentions formed part of the social studies curriculum in school up to this century. This history was often taught alongside famous explorers like Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 discovered the Americas, or some might say bumped into the Americas while looking for spices. His intention to find the Spice Isles, a place in the other direction, is often ignored. However, his return to Spain with promises of wealth and riches may well have begun the series of papal bulls that followed. Indeed, our relationship to the coloniser started as early as the 1400s, when a series of decrees or papal bulls issued by the Pope allowed European explorers to discover and seize lands inhabited by Indigenous peoples on behalf of those who maintained power in Europe. For example, Pope Nicholas V gave permission for King Alfonso of Portugal to search out and reduce any Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. Under the same pope, various papal bulls allowed full seizure of non-Christian lands and the enslavement of native non-Christian peoples in Africa and the Americas. Other decrees followed, further endorsing the rights of discoverers to seize land and enslave non-white indigenous peoples in the name of European Christian monarchs. Not to miss out, in 1496, King Henry VII issued a decree to allow explorers to claim lands occupied by heathens and infidels on behalf of England. This decree connects colonisation to the Indigenous peoples in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. When Captain James Cook arrived in Australia, there would have been up to 750,000 people who had been living on these lands for over 65,000 years. However, Cook declared the land terra nullius, that is, belonging to no one. The Indigenous people of Australia were not understood to be human. Therefore, the land was empty, so was claimed for King George III. I understand that the claim that Australia was terra nullius justified acquisition by British occupation without treaty or payment for lands. In the New Zealand context, I first heard about the doctrines of discovery in 2019. Tuia 250 marked a period of 250 years since the first onshore encounters between Māori and Pākehā in 1769. Tuia 250 was described as an opportunity to weave people together for a shared future. I asked a rather naive question of some Māori educators who lived where Cook had first landed. Why were local Māori not going to welcome the replica of Cook's endeavour into their harbour as a part of these commemorations? I was told that as one of their first acts on this land, Cook and his men murdered Te Maro, one of their paramount chiefs, and some of his gardeners. The only written record I could find of this event reads, "The English navigator, Lieutenant James Cook, sighted New Zealand on 6th of October 1769 and landed at Poverty Bay 2 days later. He drew detailed and accurate maps of the country and wrote about the Māori people. His first encounter with Māori was not successful. A fight broke out in which some Māori were killed. At the time I asked myself, why do I not know this? I'm glad I asked my question, but even more glad that the answers were presented to me so openly. I have been learning about these doctrines ever since, and I suggest if you have not heard of them, you might like to engage in some learning about this yourself. In New Zealand, the negative effects of these historical events on schooling for Māori have been long-lasting and remain to this day. Part of the answer sits within the beliefs inherent in the doctrines about a hierarchy of races. These beliefs became further embedded in society through a movement known as social Darwinism. At about the same time as the ramifications of the Treaty of Waitangi were being established, these racialised beliefs were not only being socialised across wider society, but were also appearing in primary school textbooks. For example, in 1879, a primary school textbook proclaimed, "Whites form by far the most important race, for they have the best laws, the greatest amount of learning, and the most excellent knowledge of farming and trade. There are 5 great races of men, and the white race is the highest." These racialised beliefs, were also appearing in Department of Education reports, such as this one. I do not advocate for the natives under present circumstances, a refined education or high mental culture. It would be inconsistent if we take into account the position they are likely to hold for many years to come in the social scale, and inappropriate if we remember that they are better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour. Beliefs that foregrounded formal education for my grandmother's generation. The Native Schools Act of 1867 resulted in the establishment of a separate native school system for Māori students, and public schools were for everyone else. The Native Schools Bill highlighted three principles: the Europeanisation or assimilation of the Māori population in order to civilise Māori. The purpose of schooling was seen as social control, and schools would be provided only in those areas where Māori had asked for schools and would commit their own resources, or, in other words, their own land to establish these. Education within this context would neither address Māori aspirations nor acknowledge that any potential existed. Native schools were based on a belief that Māori students were less capable. Therefore, they followed a reduced curriculum to that provided in the state schools, and health, hygiene, and manual work were emphasised. English was the medium of instruction, and increasingly and well into the next century, severe punishments were experienced by those students who spoke their own language, Māori. Practices that endangered the survival of the Māori language and raised English as the language of success, with many Māori themselves beginning to drive this hegemonic process of assimilation to this day. These beliefs continued to be reinforced through school textbooks. As an example, The World and Its People celebrates the change education has achieved since Cook's arrival from Māori being a tall, brown-skinned race of born fighters to the present time, 1912, when we are described as a cheerful and fairly comfortable race, very fond of games, riding, and feasting. These deficit beliefs and myth-takes continued through textbooks published in the UK prior to 1926 and sold to New Zealand and Australia in huge numbers, such as Our Nation's Story. I say myth-takes because rather than starting fire by the troublesome method of rubbing two sticks together, I have it on very good authority that prior to colonisation, obsidian found only on a small island off the Bay of Plenty where I live in the North Island, was traded for flint and nephrite jade with tribes in the South Island. It's interesting how these historical narratives were often then relegated to be amongst the myths and legends of the Māori. Deficit beliefs reported by education leaders of the day flowed into policies that came to us via South Africa, such as cultural adaptation, policies that led to both linguicide and cultural erasure for my parents' generation, who were physically punished for speaking Te Reo Māori, their first language at school. My father became a good farmhand on land that was confiscated from his mother's tribe to support the war effort in World War I. He had fought in World War II and passed on before, after years of struggle, his tribe finally had their lands returned. I was born by the time Māori and the Missionary was published in 1953, a textbook that remained in the Social Studies Index of Resources until 1978. However, little had changed to disrupt the myth takes about Māori for my son's generation. This textbook, which I understand from some educators can still be found in some school resource rooms, suggests that the low number of half-castes to be seen amongst the Māori villages before 1820 was the result of infanticide. Recently, I re-listened to a speech by Moana Jackson called Once We're Gardeners. He opened his speech by asking the audience if they had ever heard a series of 3 names before. Many in the audience must have indicated that they had. He then mentioned 3 more names which the audience indicated they'd never heard. He shared that the first 3 names are Māori children who died at the hands of their parents. The second 3 are non-Māori who have similarly died at the hands of parents. The point I want to make is that our school textbooks are not the only carriers of these myth takes. Indeed, over generations, they have become deeply woven into the very fabric of our society. It wasn't until 2008 that reforming schooling to ensure Indigenous Māori students could enjoy and achieve education success as Māori began to enter into our national psyche or our policy intent. For the first time, the policy known as kahikitia, meaning to step up, sought to change the system rather than fix up the deficiencies long asserted as being inherent in Māori. However, effective implementation of this policy has been challenging. Little attempt was made to understand or change the deficit discourses about Māori that had been so well entrenched in our hearts and minds over many generations. In 2012, the policy was refreshed as little change had been shown. It was also reviewed by the Auditor General, who concluded that, although there had been some progress, the transformational change that had been hoped for had not happened. We are currently in phase 3 of the same policy, demanding and expecting transformative and radical change in the education system, but doing little to help anyone understand why. Many school leaders told us they needed help to understand what success as Māori looked like if they were to respond effectively to kahikitia. Therefore, in 2015, at the very end of the school year, we interviewed a number of Māori learners who believed they had enjoyed and achieved education success as Māori. And this was well supported by their academic and cultural achievements. We heard from students who throughout their schooling had been hesitant and unsure about their sense of belonging, uncertain as to their inherent cultural capability, whether they as Māori truly had any value. It was only because of the belief and expectations of some people in their schools who had begun to maintain family-type relationships with them and take cultural responsibility to look out for them that they had begun to succeed. By the end of their schooling, they rejected any idea of changing who they were in order to experience success. Rather, they sought to grow stronger in themselves. They valued highly the opportunity that schooling afforded them to explore their own culture, language, and identity. All expressed a desire to know their culture more and to live it more, even though they still faced negative stereotypes about being Māori. The students explained that strong relationships were an important reason for their success, both individually and collectively. They consistently acknowledged those who drew them in, imbuing a sense of belonging and positioning the individual to better see their own potential. They sought opportunities to provide this support to their peers. I want to conclude with examples of what some effective school leaders have done to purposefully disrupt the status quo of intergenerational disparities for Māori. I will use what Māori learners have told us as the lens. Māori students in 2001 told us that leaders and teachers who believed in them, their culture, and their potential could develop a culture within their classrooms and schools where they felt they belonged. When this happened, the structures in schooling were also changing to strengthen this relational culture. Māori students in 2015 told us they needed help to reject the negative stereotypes about being Māori. They wanted to extend their potential and success by accessing authentic Māori ways of viewing and being in the world. And as they felt they were successful and they belonged, they would willingly contribute to the success of others. I chose 3 different schools who have each been supreme winners of the New Zealand Prime Minister's Education Excellence Awards. I acknowledge we have been privileged to work and learn alongside these schools. I will focus on some examples for each school, and I encourage you to look at their schools' websites or the New Zealand Prime Minister's Education Excellence Awards website for videos and further information. In the early years at Kirikiri High School, there was a direct challenge to staff being required to be involved in te kotahitanga. This included the Union and Professional Association for Secondary Teachers in New Zealand challenging the school by saying that teachers could not be required to undertake professional development aligned to raising the achievement of Māori, even when this was in the school's strategic goals. While this was challenging for Principal Elizabeth Forgie, it was unsuccessful, and by 2006, all parties accepted that to be a teacher at Kirikiri High School meant you were part of raising Māori achievement. At the same time, the local media ran the story that staff were unhappy and some were leaving the school. The word exodus was used. There were letters to the editor and public meetings for and against raising the achievement of Māori students. A new board of trustees took some time to realise the positive impact that this initiative was having on academic results. And while academic achievement may have been the initial driver, sustained structural and cultural changes have followed. Deficit theorising, or often also called unconscious bias, is now called out as racism. Pedagogy has changed from 80% transmission teaching from the front to 80% dialogic teaching amongst learners. Relationships include knowing Māori learners, their people and their places, and these relationships becoming reciprocal between learners and all staff. Initially, these relationships were led by an elder who worked with the principal. Now the school continues to be nurtured and supported by the local Māori tribe. Previously, if you picked up a flute or a trumpet, you could get time out of class and funding for a tutor. But when you went to kapa haka or cultural performance, It was expected that this would happen in your own time, and often the tutor was not paid. Now kapahaka is resourced in the same way as instrumental music tuition. Students are no longer leaving their culture at the school gates. They are learning about culture from each other. Like many boys' secondary schools in New Zealand, some of the initial buildings and education structures at Rotorua Boys High School are reminiscent of its colonial heritage. For example, this school has a house system, the name of each house going back to earlier colonial leaders, some of whom had established their wealth and power through rather dubious acts. In November 2020, I watched the school prize giving, at which the headmaster, Chris Grinter, announced that there would be a change in the names of the school's houses. The new names had grown from consultation with the local Māori and used Māori language and metaphors. The school was also to have its first ever woman deputy principal, and she too was Māori. It was clear that the audience were delighted by these changes. The headmaster later recalled, "I can't help thinking it has taken me too many years to see and manage these patently obvious challenges." Again, it is important to mention that when the school first started working with a focus on Māori achievement in 2012, a number of non-Māori students were withdrawn by their families. We call this white flight. Importantly, for over a decade now, there is no gap between the academic outcomes of Māori and non-Māori students. Furthermore, when it comes to achievement across the board, these boys are outstanding on a range of sporting and cultural stages, locally, nationally, and internationally. Many have enjoyed their time as a learner so much that they are becoming qualified and returning as teachers. The principal of Frimley Primary School engaged with us on a blended e-learning program that covered colonisation in New Zealand, understandings from a Māori worldview, relationships, pedagogy, leadership, and school reform. He used his own learning in this space to make a range of reform decisions that included strategic staffing, localised curriculum, and the development of more critical relationships with the local Māori community. He took the staff with him on this journey by ensuring all were able to experience the blended e-learning for themselves. The principal, Tim White, was quoted in June this year as saying, "There is still a long way to go, even when your staff and leaders are committed to transform all the structures and systems. But society is in a place now where people are much more open to it. The stark difference between what I learned of Te Ao Māori in school and what your average 5-year-old now knows is testament to what education can achieve. Schools are here to support generational shift towards becoming truly bicultural." Our agency as leaders in education means understanding the colonial legacy of prejudice and racism foundational in society today, moving beyond the ongoing appropriation of brown frills, and taking responsibility for our collective and critical conscientisation. This requires understanding and dismantling our shared history. Courageous leaders who commit to making the aspirations of kahikitea a lived reality in their schools are ensuring that this generation of Māori learners is better served by education so that they can take their rightful place in the global community. Importantly, the benefits that ensure for Māori can be for all learners. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
So Mary has given us an exemplar of a journey of colonization, of prejudice, of oppression, and of response, dismantling deficit thinking, engaging in culturally responsive pedagogy and leadership, and making a difference for all children. And we want to thank her for that. It is our great privilege now to talk directly to Mary, who is still in New Zealand, as she will come to answer your questions and interact with you at this point. So if you have questions, raise your hands. If you're in the virtual audience, send us your questions. We'll get to them at the end of this session. If you have comments, whatever you'd like to talk about, the floor is yours. And Mary's. Yes, I don't have the mics. I'm hoping somebody has.
Hi there, I'm Rupert Heim from UCL in London. Thank you so much for a really moving and inspiring talk. Lots of questions I could answer, but I'll answer on one in my area of specialty, if I may. You said in discussing the change of curriculum in schools that it moved towards an 80% use of dialogic teaching in the classroom, which is fascinating to me and very exciting. I'd like to know a little more about that, if I could, and if there's any specific power or relevance for that within the Maori tradition, or whether you just see that as pedagogically something appropriate across the board. Thank you.
It was a great question. The pedagogy, that is much more dialogic doesn't necessarily come from a traditional Māori pedagogy. In fact, we have both transmission of knowledge as well as knowledge that is more narrative, that is more pedagogical. But it came to us from the students that we interviewed in 2001. When we asked them what would engage them more in learning, they said, let us talk about our learning. Let us help each other with our learning. Let us talk with our teachers. Let us do things other than just listen to what the teachers say. So we spent a lot of time supporting teachers to change their very direct transmission teaching. I'm the expert. I can tell you about this. We supported them to find ways where students could engage in learning and engage in that learning talk. So it was a really determined effort, but it had come to us from the students themselves.
They went in frequently and worked with the teachers and listened to the teachers and observed and gave them feedback. And I was there for several of those sessions. And so it took a long time, as I said before, and as Mary said several times, it was a journey, but they really did change their pedagogy.
Could I just say to Richard that one of the things that we found was that 60-40 seemed to be the split where you could make the difference. So 60% more dialogic, relational, and 40% transmission. You were getting a change in the outcomes, the academic outcomes.
Jackie?
Hi, I'd like to thank you also. That was a really interesting, full of useful, helpful ideas presentation. My question has to do with the wider community. You said there was white flight in my experience, there's always pushback of a kind. If the Maori community was very supportive, how did the schools work with that part of the community that was not supportive of the changes and perhaps wanted to keep things in a way that advantaged them or appeared to advantage them historically?
Well, of course, we're both, Māori and Pākehā, were both taught in the same type of education system. So once the native schooling had finished, and the schooling system became one where we were taught at both levels in the same institutions, Māori were getting the same messages about themselves as non-Māori. So I just want to make that point. However, I think that the wider society, they're getting messages from the social media, they're getting messages from the newspapers, and it seems that this deficit theorising about Māori continues to be reinforced on a daily basis. You just have to turn on the news, you read a paper, you have a look at who's in trouble, and largely it's Māori. One of the things that I'm learning from the students themselves, though, is that actually Māori students want to talk and share their experiences with non-Māori. And I feel really good about our youth of today. They're certainly in a different place from my sons, certainly a different place from where I was. But the young people today are certainly much more actively trying to make sense of each other's life and the way they live and their backgrounds, and they're much more open to sharing that with each other. So I would just say those two things, that young people today, I think, are constructing new messages, and the new messages are much more about liberation and hope.
Is there a follow-up question, Jackie?
I particularly was interested in parents who are often the most articulate about perhaps not being happy with change, and how the schools worked with parents. Did the community, parents?
Well, the first school, of course, we talked about how that happened, where the teachers, some of the teachers went to the union. Some teachers left, and that was their choice to do so. And the second one with white flight, again, some students left, and that was the decision of parents. I mean, I think really you have to take a much more proactive way of dealing with this, rather than when something has happened like that, when parents have taken the children out of the school, you know, trying to change their mind. I mean, I think I'd like to think we are now taking a much more proactive way and really selling the whole idea of how much we have to learn from each other. I still know that actually there is a way to go for all of us.
Other questions?
It's Ian. Thanks ever so much for that. I'm reflecting on it deeply. Did your research reveal that when those leaders that you've cited, and they were non-Maori leaders in some cases, when did they have the moment when they realised that they needed to change in themselves? Because they'd been the product of a previous way. And as you clearly indicated, this requires a change in disposition to bring the transformation about. Were there particular experiences in their life, or was it an intellectual journey that they reached? I'm just really quite interested in how school leaders have that moment of liberation from how they've learnt to think?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. They were all Pākehā, those principles that I chose. And one of the things that we ask teachers and ask their leaders to think about was, if the education you were providing was for your child or for your niece or for your grandson or your granddaughter, what would you change about what you do? And often that was a first point. But I don't think they're just one-off aha moments. I think there are a lot of little things that spark off each other. But I do know that thinking about teaching and learning as though you were teaching your own child, what would you want for them? What would you ask their teachers? What would you ask their principal to do? And I do think that is one question that has got people thinking differently.
That's really important. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Other questions or comments? I'm glad you can see at the back, because the lights make it difficult for me to see many hands. There's one there.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting and
We can't hear
moving.
you. Is the mic on?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank
That
you.
was very interesting and moving. To build on Ian's question, I was wondering if this new change is now supported by a specific form of leadership development that would sustain this transformation or transformative journey of school leaders, and how that would continue to support not only current leaders, but also prepare the new leaders, aspiring leaders, for this role of transformation in education in a way that continues to respond to the needs of the community.
That's a great question. We have a Māori metaphor. It's whānautanga. It's the act of being whānau. And so in each of the schools that I've shared with you, one of the things that they're doing is their students are coming back as teachers because of the relational feel in the school, the respect, the reciprocity of that relationship of respect that is being experienced in those schools. Many of the students go off and they train, and then they come back and they apply for positions in that school because they like it so much. They realise that it had such a big impact on them that they want to be part of it as well. But I would say that what I've seen with those three leaders is that relationship strengthens. It doesn't dissipate. It strengthens, and it absolutely filters across to other members of their staff, so that you don't just have the leader out the front being transformative, but you have multiple places of leadership influencing across the school. So that whole idea of whanaungatanga, that whole idea of acting as whānau, being a parent or acting as parents for these students, I think is a really important point. But certainly it spreads across the whole school. And often if that's not the way you want to teach, then you leave and you go teach somewhere else.
Is there ministry support at this point for training leaders in this approach?
Absolutely. But you see, the difference is that you have to live it and experience it, not just be told that's what you have to do. And the ministry has a propensity to tell people what to do and wonder why, when they don't do it, what they've done wrong. So it has to be something that, as you said, Carolyn, it's a journey. It's an experiential journey that builds and grows.
Other comments or questions? I can't see. There's a question back here, I think.
Thanks very much, Deb Alswaite, BELMAS Vice Chair. It was a really great lecture. I really appreciated it. Thank you very much. I'm struck by the total opposite directions yet again in conversation over this weekend, with the direction that we're going in with our market reforms in initial teacher education here, where we have what Victoria described yesterday quite rightly as the revolving door that we have in and out. It's very difficult for us to currently recruit anybody from a minority ethnic background in England, but that's because we don't look at our systems properly and take into account for that. And I'm really heartened by you ending our keynote this morning with a story that's positive and where you're managing to make that bicultural change successfully, because we are not listening to those communities that we have, particularly in England, in our English context, and our system is very much the worse off for that. And I think, you know, I have taken a look at one or two of the New Zealand Department for Education policy documents, and I can see that you are making real change. I wondered if you just wanted to sort of comment on that quickly. I know you just were, really.
Yeah, I mean, I really hear what you're saying. And if you think about that policy statement, 2008, kahikitia, and we're still going in 2020. However, I know that when we do get it right for Māori, what we've been able to see is when we do get it right for Māori, we get it right for all other minority groups. And it's what gives me great hope. It is really hard to ensure the changes that are needed in society to bring about equity. But knowing that it's hard, it shouldn't put us off. And New Zealand has done some pretty spectacular things, I would say. And at the moment, we've been quite successful in the stopping of one-off use plastic bags. But I do find it very challenging that we can change society and society's use of one-off plastic bags, but we've got this intergenerational disparity going for Māori. And I just wonder, why can we make the difference with plastic bags and do that really quickly, but we can't make the difference for Māori and all other minority groups? We're still trying to plug away at that. So I guess that's because it involves working with other people. But it shouldn't stop us from trying, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're trying and making some difference, whereas we have a system which is not trying and not listening, and our system is significantly poorer for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been watching what you're doing over there, and I haven't been over to have a look, but yes, it doesn't seem as though it's very effective.
The understatement of the morning, Mary.
Yeah, well, if you had a look at our evidence in New Zealand, we're not doing amazing things for Māori either. We've got pockets of it where we are. And so I guess one of the reasons why we're not is that when you have to change what you're doing for Māori, there are people worry that somebody else is missing out. And so that whole idea of equity, I think, is at the basis of both countries in terms of maintaining a status quo that privileges some people and actually continues to cause disparity for others.
That's what we're continuing to see in New Zealand, even though what we've got is the government saying we need to change this, we need to change that, we need to change that. I don't see people running and putting their hands up, although I'm going to a conference tomorrow around the new curriculum change. And in the new curriculum change, there are expectations that we will acknowledge te tiriti, we will acknowledge a Māori worldview, we will make all of these changes. And I think that's the easy part. To say we will do it is the easy part. But to actually make the changes, like the 3 principles that I shared with you, that's the courageous, that's the challenging part. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Are there any questions from people online?
No questions. No questions online.
Pardon?
No questions.
No. Then it gives me great pleasure once again in thanking Mary for her presentation and her interaction with us. What she said was really important. The work is hard, it's challenging, but that's not a reason not to keep at it and not to do it. And so Mary, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you.
There's a video first.
Oh, there's a video first.
Yep.
Oh.
We're going to move right into the closing of the conference now. There'll be a video and then a few very brief messages.
Was that the video? Oh. I wasn't sure. Okay, so I'm going to speak, but I'm going to bring up Caroline first of all, who is our the new president for CCAM. So she wants to say a few words, and then I'm going to do some closing points on the actual conference.
I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank BELMAS for allowing us to share in this conference, working on the planning committee with Victoria and Richard and others. Patsao has been really a pleasure. It's been an easy process and we've thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to thank the executive of CCEAM that's helped to put our part of this program together. Our outgoing past president, Ken Breen, if you'd just wave, our past president, Paul Miller, our British finance expert and consultant, Ian Potter, who's back there, whom you all know. And I don't see Hawa, but she's here. Hawa Imam, whom you met last night, has been our African representative and is currently the vice president. And so thank you all again. It's been really nice to have the CCAM focus as well as the BELMAS focus. Our focus is leading across nations and across cultures, and we hope that that's what we've brought to this conference. So thank you all once again. Thank you, Victoria. That's okay. I didn't thank Amina, who's the Commonwealth Council representative. I thought perhaps Victoria was going to do that, but Amina might want to wave as well. Commonwealth Foundation representative.
Right, okay. Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you, everybody. So first of all, thank you for the success of the conference. I think that's the first thing I'd like to say. It's been amazing seeing you all again. It really has. I've no disrespect to being online and seeing you for the last, couple of years online, but it is, you can't beat actually seeing you in person. So I'm going to start with a couple of things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, don't worry. But I think that question which Ian mentioned just a moment ago, which is, so when did they realise that leaders needed to change? I think that was a really interesting question. And it may be something which you've grappled with within this room over the last 3 days as well. You may think that you don't need to change, but then all of a sudden you hear these things, you think, you know what, that's reflecting me as well. And also the other point, which I think we still grapple with within BELMAS, which is, I suppose in some ways, when we think about research, we have to remember that research helps the teaching and the teaching helps the research. And that in itself is part of the circle which we have to keep remembering. Because if we don't remember that, it's kind of, well, it's the practitioners who are the ones who are most important, or it's the academics which are most important. But it's actually a circle which helps each other. You need one with the other. So I think that's important. All right, so let's look at some of the highlights which we've gone over the last few days. So we started off, of course, with Tony Bush, Professor Tony Bush, who provided us with a really historical background to EMAL, EMAL, and which is our flagship journal. And that was a really interesting discussion which took place on Friday. And then, of course, we had some symposiums and then various sessions which we took to as well. We've had many symposiums throughout the Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And I do encourage you to think about a symposium. We've had some ideas from Ireland, that we may do one for Ireland. We had one for Scotland recently, so we may do one for Ireland, which would be really good. So please do think about that as well. The awards we had, which were yesterday, and also our regular Friday barbecue, which gets you to start thinking about things together, and our dinner and dance, which I think many of you stayed up to goodness knows what hours yesterday to enjoy yourselves together. And then, of course, our final keynote, and also the various sessions we've had. Our final keynote, of course, by Professor Berryman, which opened up another full of questions, which again pushes us back to that question, which is, so why did and when did you realise that leaders, or you as leaders, realise you needed to change? I think that's a really good question itself. At the same time, we've been able to be in Liverpool and explore a little bit what it stands for, and I hope that you've had some time to be able to enjoy some of what it has to offer. Whether it's just walking to the Docklands or whether it's just going to the shopping, whatever it is, hopefully you experience some of that. We've also tried to add a few new things, for example, the author's table. And hopefully if you did actually have a look at some of those books, you put them back on there because they're the author's books. And that, again, and that was, the reason for that was to enable some of the showcasing, because all those books were done within the pandemic, so within those 2020, where they didn't have much time to show certain things. There's been many countries here represented, which again is really part of BELMAS and how we want things to be. I would like to say, as we move into, I'd like to say a really, really big thank you for our BELMAS team, which consists of Richard. You've heard a lot about Richard already. Richard, Rachel, who was with us, Nick, and Kelly. All of those have really contributed. And of course, our new colleague, which of course is Ryan. Without them, excuse me, and along with our conference group, which consists of Steve Courtney, Ruth Bikini, Ponce Monsoy, and Catherine Simon, that group are the ones responsible for making this happen. So I think we need to give them applause as well to say thank you. I know Richard will be very, very sad not to be here this time next year with all what's going on, but but thank you. We've got Ryan who's going to be taking his place, which is great. I'd also like you to do something for me, which is to spread the word about BELMAS, because We are, as you know, a membership organisation as well. We need members to also be part of this to make it as bigger to what we want it to be. So please do that. If you've enjoyed yourself at the conference, do spread that word. Do get involved, as the video said, of the various other things which are coming up regarding BELMAS. Of course, there's things we can do better. There's lots of things we can do better, and we need to hear your voices. One of the things is better chairing. I know it's so nice to be able to be up there and speak, and you want to speak for your time and more time. But of course, then you've got people which have flown in from a different country, has taken them 36 hours or whatever it is, they've only got 2 minutes to speak, and it's because you've taken up all the time. So I think also one of the things we need to be able to do better is around better chairing. Also to support scholars, which a lot of scholars weren't able to get here. They were in the programme. I don't know whether you noticed, they couldn't get visas. And most of those are from the global south. It's a problem. We need to also be maybe a little bit campaigning to be able to get those people to be over here, because they put their aspects in there and their professors as well. They couldn't get here. They were let down. It's very, very sad. One of the things I think we could do better is some buddying and some mentoring with people who are part of BELMAS, or introducing them to BELMAS. I think that would be good as well. Things to look out for, which is mentioned on here, look out for the AGM, because that will be out there, so think about that. And finally, you might be thinking about next year. You may not be thinking about next year, but I'm thinking about next year. Next year, we're looking at the 7th of July to the 9th of July 2023, so hold that date. We haven't looked at the venue yet. Possibly, it could be Wales or Northern Ireland. We don't know yet, so it could be one of those. So if that's something you think would be quite interesting, do think about that. I've also put out themes, so I think you saw it on the loop. We're asking for some themes, some ideas from themes. If you've got an idea for a theme which you think might be of interest for our conference next year, please do email the office by the 16th of July. So it's the 16th of July this year for some themes as well. And I think I've covered most of our points which I needed to do really for the conference itself. But please, any comments, do send them in. It's really important to send them in, good or bad. We always look out for which ones are going to be, what kind of complaints you've got, what we need to do better and all things like this. We do our best, but please do say to us. And thank you very much, and enjoy your journeys, enjoy the UK, wherever you're going, and I look forward to seeing you online or next time. All right, thank you very much.